In the presence of grace. Today we bring our conversation around race to grace consciousness to a close. It's been 4 long weeks, hasn't it? There's been a lot of discussion about this. But just in case there is any confusion, let me review what we mean by race consciousness. You should all know it by heart by now, because I've gone over this every week. It has nothing to do with an individual's race, color, or ethnic origin, but rather it refers to the accumulated collective thoughts, feelings, beliefs, values, attitudes, words, and actions of the human race to which we are all subject. This month, we've been exploring various examples of race consciousness that permeate our world, and without going into the specifics of the examples, we realize that the majority of it focuses on fear and lack and limitation and separation. In a previous Sunday, I suggested that if you weren't sure if this were true or not, simply turn on the 6 o'clock news or the 5 o'clock news or the 4:30 news or the 11 o'clock news, any of them, and just watch it for 15 minutes. I guarantee you will see some form of fear or lack or limitation or separation. I don't know if any of you watch the evening news, but they usually have the world news. It's 5:30, and at the very end, they have something that's positive, uplifting, really. And so a lot of times I'll just turn in for the last 5 minutes just to see where somebody's done something that has made just a beautiful impact on the world. And I thought that's a good practice. Now they need to flip it so that they do that for 25 minutes. And maybe at the first part they talk a little bit about, this is kind of happening.
I was just reading about a journalist that quit because do you realize that journalists aren't allowed to choose their own topics? That even though they've got these good topics they want to talk about, they are shot down again and again and again.
Because negative news sells. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that we are unconsciously affected by these race-conscious ideas until we make a deliberate and conscious choice to bring a higher way of thinking, or God thinking, if you will, to it, or just turn that off completely. But we still get bombarded by it. We still see it in the world. And we have to be on guard in our minds all the time with what it is we're seeing out there. And when we bring God, which is represented by the G, to race consciousness, we get grace consciousness. So this entire month, we focused on bringing God to race consciousness so that we might live in and from grace consciousness. And we've had a wonderful exploration this month. And today, we end this topic by somewhat going back to the beginning. And what I mean by this is that we're going to look at and have the experience of the concept of grace. In fact, it's our intention this morning to be in the presence of grace. And here's just a little bit of a paradox. Even though all month we've been talking about grace consciousness, grace isn't really something that we can talk about. And when I say it isn't something we can talk about, I don't mean we shouldn't talk about it. I mean we really can't. We're not really able to, because it is part of the awe and mystery of God, and as soon as we put words to it, we confine it, we restrict it, we limit it. Our limited language is not able to do it justice. As soon as we try to describe that which is infinite and ineffable, we make it finite and limited. Grace, God's grace, is something that cannot be confined. It's something that cannot be restricted. It's something that is not limited, nor is it finite. Nonetheless, realizing that words are inadequate, I hope it brings us all to a greater heart understanding of the amazing concept behind the word grace and the power of grace to take us to a place that transcends the general consciousness of the entire human race, thereby having a hand in transforming the entire consciousness of the human race. So let us begin by doing our best to define that which is indefinable, right? I've always enjoyed looking at the etymology of a word. I love that word too, etymology. And that's its origin. And I believe I owe this to my grandmother. She was a very proper lady who was born in Boston in 1899, just a few years before you. Maybe a lot longer. And I have her high school transcripts Okay, now she finished high school when she was 17. And her classes, which she got all high grades in, were very advanced: chemistry and biology and Latin. She took Latin. And I do not believe that there are many high schools, there may be a few Catholic high schools that still teach Latin out there, but we often hear people speak about the Latin root of this word or that word. And that's how we get into discovering our English language. And my grandmother would often help me define words by taking me back to the Latin roots because she knew them. So the word grace comes to us from an ancient root word meaning favor or benefit. Our dear friend Noah Webster put a definition to grace in his most famous book, the dictionary. And according to it, God's grace is divine love and protection bestowed freely on people. Divine love and protection bestowed freely on people. In Psalms it reads, "Grace is poured upon your lips, therefore God has blessed you forever." The Apostle Paul wrote, "By grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not our own doing. It is the gift of God, not because of any works, lest any man should boast." And our founder, Ernest Holmes, writes in the Science of Mind textbook, "Grace is the givingness of spirit to its creation." If we were to summarize just that handful of thoughts about grace, we could say that grace is God's divine love, freely given to all, God's eternal protection, freely given to all, God's ever-present blessings, freely given to all, God's complete givingness, freely bestowed upon all, God's gift of absolute favor and benefit, freely given to all. These are all ways to define God's grace, inadequate though they may be. And you may have caught, I know, the ending phrase on every one of the descriptors, right? What was it? Freely given to all. Grace as divine favor, grace as eternal loving kindness of God is working for and through us constantly. You do not have to earn grace. It's not something that is paid out only to the good or deserving. Grace is not something to work for, to develop, to build up, to cultivate. It simply is, just by your being here. God's favor, givingness, love, blessings, and protection come to us simply because we are. Dr. Holmes in The Science of Mind writes, God loves all alike and causes the rain to fall and the sun to shine alike upon all. In arms which are all-inclusive, divine love encompasses everything. Doesn't that sound, what a beautiful visual right there, encompassed in the divine arms of spirit, right? Isn't that just amazingly beautiful? In the arms which are all-inclusive, divine love encompasses everything. We have probably heard, or we've all said or heard the statement at one point or another, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." What's going on for us when we say that? Usually we're feeling quite relieved that we're not in a similar situation to the person to whom we are referring, right? There's just a gigantic, wow, I got by that one. Whew, so glad it wasn't me. And there's also a gigantic error in that statement. And after our conversation so far this morning, do you see what the gigantic error is? That statement implies that somehow God's grace has been bestowed upon you, but it missed that person. That one person who you're glad that it wasn't you, right? When God was handing out grace, that person was at the refreshment stand. And that's incorrect thinking if we believe, which I do, that God's love and protection are bestowed freely on all people. Yet, and this is the key, we must receive it. We must receive it. We must accept it. We must open our hearts, our minds, and our very lives for God's grace to have its way with us. In the Revealing Word from the Charles Fillmore Reference Library, it says, Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. That is, the real saving, redeeming, transforming power came to man through the work that Jesus did in establishing for the race a new and higher consciousness in the earth. So think, just take a moment right now and think that you are climbing a mountain. The summit is an experience of the presence of God, and this is your goal, to reach that summit. Through human effort, you climb to a high meadow. It's a beautiful place, and you think you've arrived at your goal, but eventually you realize that it's not the summit. The peak is shrouded in mist. You cannot even see the trailhead which leads to the experience that you desire. At the high meadow, you must wait. No amount of human effort will take you higher. However, in the distance and through the mist, you see a woman coming toward you, and you know that she is coming to lead you higher. And her name is Grace. With Grace, you are taken into the mist, into the mystery that is the presence, and ultimately into Grace consciousness, which is your awakening into oneness. In this analogy, we climb to the high meadow through the use of our spiritual practices, our prayers, our affirmations, our denials, our visioning, our meditation, etc., and etc. These practices lift us up out of the race consciousness, and they are very important. They are so very important. During our climb to the high meadow, our spiritual practices are like a wind taking us to higher states of consciousness, and they make us receptive to God's grace. But practices alone will not reveal total oneness with Spirit. We must wait. That's the important part. We must wait for grace to come and take us higher. In other words, we can never do enough to live in the presence of grace, and we are doers, aren't we? We want to be busy. We want to be doing our part. We're not beers. But Eckhart Tolle tells us that we are moving into a state of being and not as much doing. Truly waking up to grace consciousness is not the result of working on ourselves, but a recognition of ourselves. A recognition. Remembering who we are. Let me repeat that. Truly waking up to grace consciousness is not a result of working on ourselves, but a recognition of ourselves, recognizing and remembering who we are. Joel Goldsmith in The Art of Meditation writes, "But the basis of our work is to leave your nets, to leave the search for more, and to open consciousness to the spiritual realities. Grace can only be attained by a state of inner silence, a state of inner awareness and receptivity." I will add a state of inner awareness and receptivity to the recognition of ourselves as the presence of grace. The receptivity and recognition of ourselves as the presence of grace. And when we have that recognition, when the energy of grace is recognized as ourselves, grace will come over us like a soft blanket when we need comfort, filling us with the feeling that regardless of what roadblocks surround us, whatever race consciousness says about a situation, all will be removed when the time is right. Grace is an unreasonable force. It pays no mind to what we consider difficulties. It has the power to lift us beyond our abilities and to draw support into our lives just when we need it. When such moments occur, ask yourself, as you give thanks for what you're receiving, whether the power behind the coming together of the right people and the right circumstances at the right time isn't the presence of grace. In all likelihood, it is. So let us take a moment right now and live in the presence of grace. Join me in recognizing that right here and right now, we stand in that high meadow. We recognize the woman approaching us, and we know that she goes by the name of Grace. As Grace appears through the mist, we willingly go to her, allowing her to bring us to a higher state of consciousness. We ascend out of race and into grace consciousness, recognizing that we are that which we seek. It is nothing we have. It is not something we have. It is who we are. And so it is.
So it's